A wave of youth-led countrywide protests forced Kenya's President William Ruto to withdraw a controversial finance bill. The youth are unhappy about a raft of new taxes in the country's proposed spending plan, saying they will make life even harder for the already overburdened Kenyan taxpayers. A number of the protesters were killed and dozens of others injured in running battles with police. In Nairobi, the protesters broke into parliament buildings, forcing the evacuation of legislators who were trapped in there. This week on Talk Africa, we look at what triggered youth outrage in the proposed law, the role of the IMF in Kenya's economic policies, and what can be done. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Professor Kabub, the face of these protests in Kenya are the youth. Did this come as a surprise to you?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on the show, and let me express my solidarity with the people of Kenya and sincerest condolences to the families of the victims of this tragedy. Unfortunately, we've seen this cycle before in so many countries on the African continent and the rest of the global South, with countries who are set up to be in a debt trap, like Kenya's situation, and then are forced to rewire their entire economic priorities to prioritize debt payments. Let's not forget that 50% of Kenya's export revenues are now destined to service external debt, including debt to the IMF. So this is not new. This is not unique, unfortunately. But then when the country is forced to rewire those priorities to service the debt rather than invest in the building blocks of development and prosperity and health and education and creating jobs for its young people, then you see revolts, because no country can function under such circumstances. And especially if we aspire to have a democratic system where the government is supposed to be the voice of the people. And when you throw the interest and the political mandate and the demands of your people under the bus to prioritize payments, it's not surprising to see a reaction from young people and from the population of this kind.
So if you go on that note, though, that it is not new here, why is the government then pushing a tax agenda while Kenyans say they are already overtaxed?
Well, the government is out of options, not because there are no options, but because the economic model that is presented to them, the dominant economic model, doesn't provide alternatives. You must remember the famous phrase from Margaret Thatcher from the 1980s, where she said, "There is no alternative to the market, to austerity, to all of this." And that's a lack of imagination, that's a lack of vision, and it doesn't mean that there are no alternatives. The alternatives do exist. And if you listen to African voices from civil society, from think tanks, from researchers who have Africa's interest at heart, you'll find all kinds of alternative options. It's just those options reject the economic model of the IMF, of the World Bank, that is truly a colonial, extractive, abusive model that leads to these results.
Professor Fadu, I want to hear your take on that and that anger from Kenyans on the IMF.
Well, we have to recognize that the current Kenyan government is really not walking into a clean slate, in the sense that the Kenyan economy has been, steered from abroad by the IMF, by the World Bank for decades now. So the fact that the Kenyan government is under financial stress to prioritize debt payments today is the result of decades of economic entrapment, of debt traps that have been set up by the IMF, by the World Bank, and other financial institutions. So that has to be recognized. The other thing is that this is a question of economic sovereignty. Are we serious about a government of the people, by the people, for the people in a democracy, when economic choices are imposed from abroad? We can't have economic sovereignty if we don't have energy sovereignty, if we don't have food sovereignty. These are the building blocks of economic activity, of actual prosperity. And if we're a sovereign country trying to make decisions for ourselves, but we don't have the option because we must borrow money to buy food, we must borrow money to import fuel for the country, then we have an economic system that is structurally and economically still colonized. And the fact that we have this clash now between a democratic process and this lack of economic sovereignty is a reminder that we cannot have a democracy in a system that hasn't been structurally and economically decolonized yet, because it forces our elected officials to prioritize the demands of external forces over the demands of their own people.
Gentlemen, thank you all very much. But on that note, let's take a short break. When we return, we will explore the historical context of IMF policies in Africa and their impact on economies. We will also discuss potential alternatives and solutions for Kenya's ongoing challenges. To stay with us. Welcome back to the program. Now let's continue with the discussion. Still with me, Cuba Houghton, economic researcher, and Professor Fadel Kaboub, senior advisor, Power Shift Africa. Professor Kaboub, from your understanding of how the Bretton Woods institutions work, are there examples of IMF policies that have actually helped out any African country?
Well, actually, if you look at the history of IMF intervention in Africa, including with Kenya, since the 1970s to this day, you'll notice that many African countries have been under an IMF program almost continuously. That is, every 3 to 5 years, there's a new IMF agreement, more or less. And the fact that we are in a debt trap today, after the IMF essentially dictating and micromanaging domestic public policy and having so much influence in how our governments manage their finances domestically, the fact that we're in a debt trap means one of two things. Either the IMF is providing incompetent advice to our governments, or the IMF is actually engaging in intentional entrapment. When you look at the kinds of economic policies that they try to impose on our governments, they're the kinds that go to the core of the basic pillars of development and prosperity and systematically destroy them. They discourage governments from investing in infrastructure, health, education, the basic pillars of development and prosperity, and they encourage our governments to prioritize extractive economic activity that will generate dollar revenues to service the debt. So it's very hard to dismiss the fact that this is intentional entrapment. So it's time to reject all of these external influences and this extractive neo-colonial type of economic policy advice.
So having gone through that in the 80s and 90s, why then do African countries, having weaned itself from the IMF World Bank policies, why then return?
Well, this is a failure of lack of vision, of lack of thinking on our parts as African countries. Because as you know, if you don't have a strategic, long-term, transformative vision for yourself, I guarantee you're already part of somebody else's strategic vision. And those institutions that serve the interest of particular countries. I mean, the IMF is dominated by U.S. interests. So the U.S. has a strategic vision for itself, and it's going to use its economic incentives, its economic diplomacy, its policy instruments, including the role of the IMF, the World Bank, and the WTO, to nudge all the other countries to where they want to see them on that economic and geopolitical map. And the role that most countries in the global South and the global North assign for us is to be the place for cheap raw materials for their industries. Number two, to be the consumers of industrial output in our large consumer markets, consumption from the global North industrial base. And number three, to be the place where obsolete technologies, assembly line manufacturing that is no longer needed in the global North is outsourced to us under the label of development, cooperation, and job creation. But effectively what it does is that it locks us at the bottom of the global value chain permanently. And that's been the case for most African countries during colonial times, during post-colonial times, and especially after the 1980s debt crisis. That was the opportunity for the IMF and the World Bank to further reinforce that neo-colonial extractive role that we play in the global economy. And it's our responsibility as governments, as people of the global South, to lay out a strategic vision for ourselves to escape those colonial traps. And unfortunately, our leadership has been unable to lay out such vision.
So if we look at that, Professor Kabubu, if the IMF's policy recommendations have repeatedly failed to benefit African countries, can these countries develop local solutions to their economic problems?
Absolutely. I mean, when you look at the source of external debt, which is the main problem here, for most African countries, including for Kenya, it's three major sources. Number one, it's food imports. In Africa, we import 85% of our food, when we used to be the breadbasket for colonial powers less than 100 years ago. That's not by accident, that's by design. So when you look at just the food source of external debt, every metric ton of wheat, of corn we produce in Kenya saves us the equivalent of dollars we had to borrow to feed ourselves and interest we had to pay for the next decade or more. So that is one step getting out of that debt crisis. The second source of debt entrapment is energy imports. And that means our biggest opportunity, according to the International Energy Agency, as a continent, by 2040, Africa can produce 1,000 times its energy needs with existing technology, not with new innovation. 1,000 times. That is to make the African continent the economic and energy powerhouse of the planet. And that is unfortunately being perceived as a threat by non-African countries rather than an opportunity for everyone. And then finally, the kind of industrialization or manufacturing base that was that we were allowed to have in Africa is the kind where we have to import the machines, you have to import the fuel to power the factories, you have to import the intermediate components to be assembled with low-cost labor, and we even import the packaging. So we end up in a structural trap where the value-added content of what we export is small, the value-added content of what we import is high, so we can double, triple, or quadruple our exports. We're always locked at the bottom of the value chain. So these are the sources of external debt. And the thing is, when you have these structural deficits, the value of our currency weakens relative to the dollar. And we've seen this with the Kenyan shilling, with so many other African currencies. And with the weak currency, anything we import the next morning, whether it's food or fuel or medicine, we import it at a higher cost. So we literally import inflation in the most sensitive areas, which is why you're seeing these protests. So what do we do as governments when we face this pressure, and when we face the pressure from our people? The governments move immediately into a defensive band-aid solutions. So what do? We subsidize food, we subsidize fuel to protect the most vulnerable, which makes perfect sense. But it's unsustainable to do this for decades without addressing the root cause of the problem.
With you back to Kenya here, the president has listened to the public, but it has not pacified Kenyans. He has withdrawn the bill. What more should he do? What can he do now?
The president needs to, commit to leading a different approach to economic development in Kenya and on the African continent. President Ruto is a leader not just in Kenya, but he's really a leading voice for development and climate action and climate finance for the continent, if not for the global South. So it's time for President Ruto to stop listening to the IMF, to stop listening to the World Bank, to stop listening to G7, to stop listening to American influence, and really listen to the African people, to the African civil society organizations, to the African think tanks who have laid out an alternative development vision that will simultaneously decolonize the African economies and will simultaneously move us forward on climate finance, on climate adaptation. All of the solutions are available. It's just a matter of, do you want to go to the red carpets in Washington, D.C. and Paris and listen to that advice, or do you want to listen to African voices?
All right. Thank you all very much for being a part of this program. But that's all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to our guest, Professor Fadel Kabubu, Senior Advisor, PowerShift Africa. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation through our social media platforms on Facebook and X, formerly known as Twitter. And you can watch this and other editions of Talk Africa on our YouTube playlist. Do join us again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team here in Nairobi. Until next time, goodbye.